All right, this is our third section of the AP Art History Big Review, and so let's get to it. All right, so in 1837, Daguerre makes this image, although it's not the first real photographic image. That was 11 years earlier in 1826 with Joseph Neophori Epps. And that's it's outside a window. It's like an architectural sort of setting, which makes sense because, and I've always wondered this, but then I came across it with the Smart video that it took 15 to 20 minutes for an exposure time. So no wonder they did still lives and architectural structures. And one of the things that's emphasized as well is that, okay, what do you do with this new artistic process? What is your subject? And so you're kind of limited. Actually, we are limited by the fact that what's in front of you has to be still for 15 to 20 minutes. So it makes sense that inanimate objects would be the focus. And also, Daguerre is trying to get people to think about the fact that this is not just a mechanical process, that it is a new artistic medium. And that takes a long time. Embarrassingly, lots of museums didn't have a photography department for a very long time, or a photography curator. And that's changed, I'd say, over the last 30 years or so, probably. Okay, so that's Daguerre with one of the first photographs ever. And then this is Muybridge. We've talked about it a lot in class and also recorded. Only thing I need to add is that the horse's name was Sally Gardner. I never knew the horse's name. But, of course, Leland Stanford hired Muybridge to set up a battery of cameras that were clicked with some small thread across this so I guess sort of alleyway that the horse would go through with its rider, and with numbers, I guess numbers 2 and 3 at the top row, you can see that, yes, indeed, horses' hooves all are off the ground at some point in its stride. Okay, so, and that's quite a bit later. That's a big leap. So you go with Daguerre's work is 1837. This is a work from 1878. So quite a few years there. Let me see if I can figure it out. Yeah, it's 39 years separates them. Is that right? Yeah, I did the math right. All right, there you go. And then this, of course, is, we have to have an example of, a couple of examples, but really the, sort of the recognizable Monet. You have to have a Monet in the 250. I just don't think you can avoid it. So Impressionism is 1870 to 1890, and this is a train station. And so let's talk about the reasons why Impressionism happens. One is just what we looked at, photography. If you can, through a process of longer than 15 to 20 minutes, because then you had to, mix the chemicals and such. But if you can come out with an image within a couple of hours that's realistic, why continue to paint realistically? And so photography does have a direct impact on the development of Impressionism. Also, tubes of paint. I've come across just recently I think in a couple of one in a magazine and then somewhere else, this whole just revolution that happens with the chemical processes that makes new colors. And of course, Van Gogh, who we're going to talk about in a couple minutes, takes incredible advantage of these new, just out of the factory sort of colors that never existed before the Second Industrial Revolution. Also, because they're in tubes, now people don't have to have their apprentices or them actually, they don't have to mix the organic material, put it in the oil, so on and so forth. It's just so much faster and compact, and they could go out on these trains to areas outside of Paris and other metropolitan areas and do their painting with their, having their tubes of paint, having a small easel, and paint plein air, paint what you want to look at in your works in front of you, as opposed for them to be in the studio. And another thing is if you have all these new ideas, Darwin says we're evolved from apes. Freud believes we have a subconscious. And if you have Karl Marx saying all history can be explained by the rich exploiting the poor, it would make sense that if all of these new ideas are arising, that your world is changing through the Second Industrial Revolution, that you would have finally a change in art, that you're not measured by your ability to render, a jar in realistic fashion. That's done by photographs now. So the personal aesthetic of the artist becomes really, really important. And it still is today. So it's the start, and I think it's really the start of modernism. Some people think there's a few cases in which maybe there was some other movements that started modernism, but I think most people agree, or the majority of people agree, that it's really Impressionism where we start. And another thing that's happening that the Smart Art History video kind of emphasizes is the mixing of social classes, which you can see a little bit to the right, but yeah, definitely in public transportation, you have a little bit of the mixing. Okay, so that's Monet. And then this is Monet's in the top left, Olympia. I used to have this VHS tape that really gave a interesting sort of look at Monet's Olympia. It was highly controversial. It was accepted by the Salon. Most people that went up to it just hated it, partly because Olympia is a sex worker, and it is a critique of this nouveau riche class that's becoming rich and hiring courtesans, sort of, I guess, a higher level sort of sex worker. There's also in the video, the Smart History video, there's a discussion of. There's been some new scholarship about the woman who we believe was from the Caribbean and presenting the flowers to the model Victorine, otherwise known as Olympia. And yeah, so there's so much with regards to how the female nude was done in the past, especially with Titian's Venus of Urbino. And you can see that in the right bottom, there's a whole effort to show the maids getting out some dresses from the cassone. But in Monet's work, there's just really kind of a lack of depth and a sort of a flatness to the background, which I'm sure was very criticized by the Salon. Okay, that's good for that. And then here we have a Mary Cassatt print, and one thing that should be noted is that in 1890, at the Beaux des Arts, there was a show of Japanese woodblock prints, and it created a sensation throughout Paris. And we know that Mary Cassatt went to that show, and I would invite you to click on the hypertext and look at the exact woodblock print that actually influenced this particular painting. It's a print, sorry. Yeah, and so from summer, fall 1890 to, I think, spring or winter of 1891, she just took off with her printmaking processes, very experimental and very highly influenced by Japanese woodblock prints. Okay, that's good. All right, Starry Night. So Van Gogh also very much benefits from the new chemical colors that are coming out, the really bright colors that you see in this image. And it is kind of interesting. I do agree that you have all this sort of turbulence in the sky, and yet the village itself is fairly quiet. There's also a little bit of discussion, I think, that comes from this new show on cypresses in Van Gogh's work. And if you click on it, you'll see, I think it's something like 40 examples, including things from his artistic journals, different mediums. But yeah, so, and one of the things they talk about in the video is that cypresses are oftentimes connected to death, which I had no idea about, that cypresses are oftentimes trees that are next to cemeteries or in cemeteries. And so they think there might be a sort of a death sort of to the heavens sort of thing going on with the large cypress tree to the left. And then one of the most interesting things I've heard in art history, I have to say, within the last 5 years or so, is there was a study that came out that said that actually Van Gogh was able to see complex fluid dynamics. And so I have to read a little bit more into it, but what I got out of it was maybe he's just not being abstract with his Starry Night. Maybe he's painting something that he was able to have a sense of, which is fluid dynamics. I think it's a really interesting theory, and I'll read more about it. Maybe you should too. Okay, so here's Paul Gauguin's, what's this one labeled? Oh yeah, Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? There's a new book out talking about, hey, Gauguin didn't have syphilis. They found 3 of his teeth in this near one of the house that he, I think, died in, and so there's this woman who's written this book that's really revisionist, saying, Gauguin wasn't a horrible person. I'm not buying it. He's still, I don't want to get into it. It's just, he abandoned his family, went to Tahiti, and some of his paintings are pretty disturbing, actually. But anyways, so yes, this is from Tahiti. He's interested in the indigenous religion. He's interested in, the differences in clothing and such. I like his works. I don't totally dislike everything that he did, but I have to say, I do like his works from the region of Brittany, and his actual painting of Breton women, which I'm really fascinated by. And so, yeah, so check that out if you're not a Gauguin fan. Okay, so all of these. Well, let's do one more. Let's look at Cezanne. So Cezanne is known for sure. I agree with the commentators. He's known for his still lifes of apples, and then his paintings of Mount Saint Victoire, which is in southern eastern France. And he did a number of paintings of this mountain. And you can see that he, along with the Impressionists, he's a part of the Post-Impressionists who start in 1875. Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cezanne, and a few others. You probably should talk about Georges Seurat in this, all of this Post-Impressionism works. That is a term used at MoMA very early on in the 20th century to kind of group together artists who came after the Impressionists. Imagine that. But I think one of the things that comes out with this particular painting, and I've talked about this before, and it's been recorded before, is that Cezanne was very influential with Picasso and Braque with regards to Cubism, as you can see in this painting. All right. Then we got to do this. All right. So when I saw these two works together, I thought, okay, yeah, sure, The Kiss with Klimt makes sense. Brancusi's The Kiss is not exactly understandable as much. I mean, I think what they're trying to do is to create for you an example of two works that you could compare across the board from each other, which is, a mainstay of the essays on the exam. They do talk about the influence, and I've talked about this as well, of Byzantine mosaics surrounding the couple. And again, we're going back to a flat surface, which obviously becomes very important for the abstract expressionists. And then you have this beautiful sort of nature. It's almost like a plinth of some kind that they're kneeling on. And then I didn't realize, and I think this is a good thing to mention, that they have crowns in a way. There's a sort of a leaf crown on the man's head, and then I can't remember what the colors are for the woman. I can't see it very well because when I do these recordings, the images become very small. And then you got Brancusi on the right. Man, we are done with realism with Brancusi. And it's an interesting piece, I would say, to say the least. But yeah, minimalistic hair, eyes, and arms, and I don't think the exam would ever put these two together in the next couple years, because I think they have in the past. And by that time, hopefully they will have changed the 250, in my humble opinion. All right, we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back. Okay, so we're back. We're looking at Matisse's, where are we at? Okay, yes, the goldfish. I didn't know that Moroccans love goldfish and that he traveled. I knew that he had traveled to Morocco for sure, and I don't think he did that. I don't think he did that just once. And then he's back in his studio. Excuse me. And it's kind of about contemplation too, in some of the texts that I read. And what I have always found interesting about Matisse is that outright, he said, I want people to love my paintings. I want them to love the beauty of my paintings, which is not exactly every artist's intent. Let's just say that. Okay. Here we go. All right. So the people at Smart History say this is the second most recognizable work next to Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. I don't know about that. You should know that there's 4 versions, not all done in with paint. You should also know that it's a part of a frieze, the Frieze of Life, which has sort of a similar color palette for sure. And so it was never meant to be an individual work of art, although we see it as such today. And I've always told the story about how 10 years before he did this painting that it's possible he did see a red sky because of a volcano going off in Indonesia. And lo and behold, the smart history people talk about it. So I wasn't just perpetuating a myth, which is good to know. All right. So yeah, Modern Life, The Scream. All right, so I always knew that originally I thought there was just one man in this very famous painting that he took out after the initial sketch. But actually there was 2 men. And this is a brothel scene with sex workers. It's one of the most... Is it Picasso's most famous painting? I would say so. Yeah. And they also talk about in Smart History how, yes, he was interested in the aesthetic and such of the African mask, but he wasn't necessarily that interested in African cultures. He saw it sort of a means to an end. And also there was some early sculptures uncovered, I think during his lifetime, or maybe before, Iberian sculptures, and the eyes, particularly, of the 2 middle women, are influenced by those sculptures. That's another fact I know about this painting. The second guy, I guess, that I had no idea existed in the original sketches was a doctor, which is kind of interesting, holding a skull. I might have to look more into that. Okay, so there's 2 types of cubism. One is called analytical cubism, and that's when you start off with a whole image and then break it apart. And the second one, which isn't as popular, is synthetic cubism, where you start with disparate objects and put those objects together to form a whole. So that's kind of interesting. Braque, of course, one of the most overshadowed artists of all time because Picasso became so famous. But yeah, this is one of Braque's analytical cubist paintings called The Portuguese, 1911. All right. So here is a work by Kandinsky, who was Russian but spent a lot of time in other European countries. And it's little known that actually in Tsarist Russia, a lot of what we know today as the beginnings of abstraction begin before the Russian Revolution of 1917. So this propaganda by Americans that only in a free and just society could abstract expressionism ever have been created is false. It's actually in this horrible time period in Russian history before even the revolution of a lot of political unrest and such. And it's not totally abstract. In the right-hand corner, you look and see some buildings a little bit, but eventually he does get to total abstraction. And now, of course, he's being overshadowed, and I think rightly so, by Hilma af Klint, who was a Swedish artist who was doing abstraction way before him. So We can no longer say he's the father of abstraction, which I think is a great thing. I mean, this artist, nobody had really ever heard of her until like 5 years ago, and now she is the subject of a lot of different exhibitions. Okay, so Kirchner actually is a German expressionist, and expressionism, we're saying, starts in 1905. But the most famous expressionists were the German expressionists, all of who had some exposure to the death and destruction and horribleness of World War I. And he was actually a transportation driver, but because of his health was allowed to go back home, and that's when he did this painting. He never lost his right hand, but as is pretty typical of German expressionists, he's exhibiting the horror, and instead of showing just a psychological damage, he's showing a physical damage to him through this whole war. Certainly, Beckmann is probably the most famous of the German expressionists to do this. If you look at his self-portraits before the war and then after the war, they're extremely different. Then you also have Otto Dix, who was actually in the trenches. He's got some horrific prints and also paintings. And then you've got George Gross, also, who is more known as a painter than anything else. All right, and then we're going to get to Cathay Kollwitz. So I looked this up because I wanted to get this right. So her 18-year-old son, Peter, died in the very beginning of World War I. In fact, October of 1914. And it really changed her art. And she did a number of different series that show a lot of just darkness and angst and just melancholy. And the smart history people look at this as an example of possibly being influenced by lamentation scenes, maybe even Picasso, maybe even Giotto, which I thought was really interesting. Okay. We're going to pause for a second. I'll be right back. All right, we got 4 more. So I was looking up the specifics because sometimes, they just get lost. So famously in 1917, Marcel Duchamp came across a unjuried show in New York City. And so he and his friends went to a plumbing supply store and bought a urinal, put it on its kind of side a little bit, and then put one of his aliases, R. Mutt, 1917. They didn't accept it, caused a huge kind of like controversy. But for our purposes, I think we need to realize that this is an incredible moment in the history of art, because along with other ready-mades that he made, Duchamp is saying no longer does an artist have to be the person that makes the particular work. And this, of course, goes into conceptualism, which is something that's very important in art today. There was an article, huge, like 2 or 3 different articles in the New York Times about the Marcel Duchamp show at MoMA right now. And it talks about I think the headline is Marcel Duchamp, the most influential artist of the 20th century, or maybe in art history altogether. And I would totally agree with that. I've always said that, that I believe that. So was good to get some reinforcement there. And of course, he's a member of the Dada movement, and the Dada movement starts in 1915 and goes all the way up to 1923, and it questions the definition of art, and there's sort of a silliness to it for sure. They always claim that they just opened a dictionary and pointed to Dada, which means hobby horse. So Dada and conceptualism are still very much relevant today, that's for sure. Okay. And so a lot of the Dadaists become surrealists. Probably the most important one would be Max Ernst. And this is a work by Merit Oppenheim, who was Swiss French, I believe. And so I've listened to Katie Hessel's podcast, the Great Women Artists podcast, and I came across one for this work. It's called Object, 1936. And apparently the story goes, and this is straight up from the artist through her niece, that she was having a meal with Dora Maar and Picasso, who were at that time were a couple. Dora Maar is an artist in her own right. And they saw these fur bracelets that she had created, Oppenheim had created. And so she was showing it to Picasso, and Picasso said, well, everything should be made out of fur. And so that was the sort of the genesis of the whole piece. And then later she bought a used teacup and saucer and spoon, and apparently she had in her fashion collection Chinese gazelle fur. And so that's what it is. I knew it was, obviously it's an animal, but I didn't know specifically what the animal was. And so surrealism is all about the subconscious, the Freudian subconscious, and connecting to it. And it can be disturbing at times, for sure. That's part of it. And most people sort of just are disturbed by the idea of having tea with fur. Okay, Jacob Lawrence. I think Jacob Lawrence is one of the most famous and important African-American artists of the 20th century. I would even go further and say he's just an important artist of the 20th century. But for sure, one of the most famous. And his most famous work, of course, he did very, very young. It's 60 panels, and it's of showing the great migration of blacks up from the South to the North. And it lasted from 1910 to 1970. They were trying to escape Jim Crow in the South, and that's why you have large populations of blacks in, particularly in Chicago and Cleveland and in D.C. And so this is showing segregation. It's pretty easy to understand. I've seen it on the exam a couple of times, actually. So the whites, between the whites and the African Americans in this restaurant is a barricade. And it, again, it's pretty straightforward. It's easy to understand. All right. Then last but not least, is Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy is what I always say, but that's wrong. It's Savoy. And this is a really, really, really important building to the history of architecture. It's a house, and I didn't know it has a garage downstairs. The Smart Art History video talks about it. So it's an example of what we call international style of architecture, which has no ornamentation. Okay, so that's very different from 19th century architecture. It has non-load bearing walls so that you can have a lot of windows, and it has a flat roof. There's an area near us when we walk the dogs that has just all modern architecture, and it's all influenced by this particular work by Corbusier. Okay, we're done. That feels good. Hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye.